EA Sports. It's in the game. All right, let's go ahead and get to it. From the EPR Creations studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you the Unconquered podcast, or Unconquered with Doc Staples if you prefer that name. So, as always, this podcast brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. And Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Starting to be a pretty good time to buy. And if you are in one of those states, give Justin Galloway a call, and he will make sure that you get the absolute best in service. He'll hook you up, y'all. Give him a holler. Let him know you heard about him from Unconquered. All right, we are now at the point in the year where it's time to do a full season preview. And, it's interesting. I was looking at my notes from last year and, frankly, hit it out of the park. If you want to go back and listen to last year's preview, that one stood up pretty well to to how things went. And I'll go through a few of those comments from that preview on this one, but be interesting to see if this year's comes anywhere close to being right. But yeah, I felt really good about it. So put in the same kind of work for this one and feel like I've got a decent handle on this team coming into the season, though I think last year's team, there was a little bit more certainty about some things than you've got with this year's team. But we'll see. Now, before I do the full preview, there are a couple of mailbag things that have come in that I do want to address. I was going to do a full mailbag podcast on this, but frankly, I'm just running out of time. I was hoping to have this. I'd taken down the work for this to get this out a little bit earlier than what it's going to come out. And I'm trying to get all this stuff done. So it is what it is. So I got a question from Jonathan, and it was basically it was based on David Hale's ACC wide receiver tight end rankings, where essentially Hale ranks the ACC wide receiver tight end groups as follows: number 1, SMU; number 2, Miami; then tier break, number 3, Virginia Tech; number 4, UNC; number 5, NC State; number 6, Georgia Tech. Tier break. So now you're in tier 3. UVA, Louisville, and Q's. Tier break. Number 10, Wake Forest. Number 11, Florida State. Number 12, Cal. So number 11 in the ACC for the wide receiver tight end group. And tier 4. And Jonathan's question was, in what specific areas and why has Florida State underperformed at homegrown production of the wide receiver position? Outside of the transfer portal hits in Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman the past 2 years and solid production from Pokey, where has the consistency and growth at the position been demonstrated? Does this make for a prove-it season for Ron Dugans? So those are good questions. Really what I want to get at, though, is something that we've talked about before. And this has been a prime point on this podcast for dang near 10 years. And that is, it takes a while for wide receivers to be ready in college at this level. Wide receiver, with very few exceptions, and you're going to see one for Ohio State this year, Jeremiah Smith. With very few exceptions, wide receiver is not a plug-and-play position. You know, the Julio Joneses of this world, the Calvin Ridleys of this world are really, really rare. There's maybe 1 or 2 of them a year, if that many. And sometimes you'll see freshman wide receiver going nuts, but usually that's not the case. And normally when they do go nuts, first of all, it's one of those rare guys. And second of all, he's gone to a place where that was absolutely needed. Another one, Sammy Watkins. Those guys just aren't normal. Now, what that means is it takes a little bit. Normally, if you recruit quality wide receivers, it's going to be, if they're early enrollees, year 2, and even more often, year 3 before they really splash. And that's all the more the case if you get athletically gifted, but raw athletes at the position. So your Keith Gavins, your Hakeem Williams, those types of guys take longer. Your big body guys tend to take longer at that position than the smaller guys in terms of their early development. It's easier usually for the smaller guys to basically adjust to the sorts of things that they have to do at this level. But even normally it takes a year at least of being in the program, a year and a half before they're ready. Now, what that means is Florida State has basically needed to have, if you're thinking about what receivers would need to be ready to roll for this year, who is third year or older that's been in this program? So this being 2024, what that means is you should be expecting the 2021 and 2022 wide receiver high school recruits to be the ones that really make a difference. Well, let's look at who those players are. In 2021, Florida State signed Destin Hill, Malik McClain, and Joshua Burrell at wide receiver. So Burrell ultimately ended up just not being fast enough, not being explosive enough. And look, he was a really good player to have on the roster for a while, but ultimately was just not a starter caliber athlete at wide receiver. So that was that. McClain got passed up pretty early in the process, showed some promise, but ultimately transferred out and then really didn't do anything at Penn State last year either. And then Destin Hill took a little while to get on campus, had people questioning whether he was actually real or not. And then now he's going to be out for a knee injury, but he would have probably been, I mean, he was in position to be the number 2 guy, the number 2 wide receiver on this team coming into this season. Then 2022, you're looking at what guys did they sign? 0 guys out of high school. And then they got Winston Wright, Deuce Spann, and Micah Pittman. Spann is still around. The other 2 are not. So then we get to 2023 and you get Hakeem, right? So you get Hakeem Williams. Then you go down to Goldie Lawrence, who ultimately got signed over, essentially recruited over. All-Day Dre, Vandrevius Jacobs, who also got recruited over and, found his way out of the program for several reasons. And that's it. And then you got, some transfers. So you ultimately have to go back a little bit before that to the first recruiting class when they got on campus and find Kentron Poitier and Darian Williamson as the guys that they recruited in that class. And honestly, those were guys that they bet on potential, on upside, and they've been solid, steady players, but neither's a game-breaking player. Neither's a top-tier talent. And frankly, those are guys that they wouldn't sign this next cycle because of how much they've gotten the Florida State recruiting back on track. So no, I don't think that this is a prove-it year for Ron Dugans. I think this is a situation where when Mike Norvell got on campus, they couldn't attract top receiver talent because it was not an attractive place to be. There were no quarterbacks on the roster when they signed. Remember, how many quarterbacks had Willie Taggart signed? Yeah, exactly. So now you look at the guys that are remaining. You got Poitier and Williamson on the outside and Ja'Kai Douglas on the inside. Those guys are going to be solid options. And then they've had to supplement through the portal because they just couldn't get the top tier talent through high school recruiting initially. Now, if you look at the last couple years, Hakeem Williams last year, this year you look at BJ Gibson, you look at LaWayne McCoy, you look especially at Elijah Moore, you look at Camden Fryer. Those are all guys that can play. You look at next year's cycle, and they're even upping the talent level even more. So no, this is not a prove it year. This is a matter of needing to improve the talent on the roster. I've got another mailbag question somewhere that I'll probably put in at the end, but that'll be good for now. Now let's go ahead and jump into the season preview. So, what I did last year is we started with reasons for optimism, and then worked from that, and then reasons to take the under on the Vegas over-under for Florida State season, which this year is 9.5 from what I'm looking at the books here. It took me just a second to look that up, but 9.5. So, that's a healthy number. But basically, what I did is I divided things into, reasons to think that Florida State may exceed 9.5 wins, and reasons to expect them, reasons to be pessimistic. Started with that and then went from there. So we're going to do the same thing. So starting with reasons for optimism, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what were last year's team's weaknesses. What are the places where this year's team might be better? Were they able to identify and shore up last year's weaknesses? We did this last year. Now we're going to do it again this year. So first of all, last year's weaknesses. Interior offensive line was a major weakness. And you can go back and listen to the offensive line preview for the numbers on that. But Roddick and Emmanuel in particular struggled on the offensive interior. And when Keandre Jones was on the field, they were significantly better running the football in terms of yards before contact and all sorts of other things. They gave up a lot of penetration, especially on that interior offensive line last year. That was a problem. And that was a major problem for a team that needed to be able to run the football with more consistency than they were able to last year. They were a bit more of a boom and bust running game last year largely because of some struggles on the interior offensive line. So then offensive tackle depth specifically was an issue. You had edge depth was a major issue. Gilbert Edmond was your number 3. Speed at wide receiver was a major issue. Tight end was average once Jaheim Bell got banged up. Safety depth was a significant concern going into the season. Dent and Knowles were an or, and then everybody else behind Shaheem Brown and Dent and Knowles were freshmen. And when Dent got banged up and Knowles was out there, or when they went into 6 DB stuff and Knowles was out there, Knowles was playing out of position. And it really did hurt them at times. The fourth linebacker, Omar Graham, got banged up, and all the others were freshmen and not quite ready. And then, another one that I would put as a weakness last year, Jordan Travis was not super accurate as a thrower in terms of ball location and in terms of being able to push the ball downfield. He was a very good deep ball thrower, but on non kind of bucket throws and things, he was more limited on some of that stuff, and missed a lot of throws in the strike zone, that sort of thing. So those were weaknesses for last year. Now, they aggressively worked to improve those areas. They self-scouted, they identified those areas, and I think they hit across the board on a lot of this. Interior offensive line, they've moved from Roddick and Emmanuel to Richie Leonard, TJ Ferguson, and then they added Jacob Rizzi, the Harvard transfer, as additional depth at center. And then you've also got the growth of Andre Otto helping in there as well. But Roddick and Emmanuel versus Richie Leonard and TJ Ferguson, I think it's a significant improvement in 2024 over what they had in 2023. The guards last year were suspect, as one might say. This year, I think Leonard and Ferguson, along with the return of Keandre Jones, makes that group much better. I think you can expect a lot better in the interior offensive line. Offensive tackle depth, you lose Bless Harris, which I still think was a loss you really didn't want to have. But you get Robert Scott back, and Robert Scott, basically missed pretty much all of last year. He was not really out there. And then you also have Early and Simmons further along. Simmons wasn't even practicing last year. So offensive tackle depth, you've got 3 guys that are that you really trust, that you feel comfortable with, and then a couple young guys that are coming along that you start to feel like you can get those guys into games if you get up enough in the fourth quarter. So I think improvement on the interior offensive line, improvement at offensive tackle depth, feel better about those. Edge depth. Now you lose Verse and Edmond. So losing Verse is painful, but losing Edmond is addition by subtraction. And in their place, you add Marvin Jones Jr. and Sione Lolohea, and then you get Turner a year older as your fourth defensive end, and then Hester coming on as a fifth defensive end. I think you've got significant improvement at edge depth. Now, we've talked about how, as good as Jones may be, you're still not going to expect him to be able to do all the stuff for you that Verse did. Speed at wide receiver. That was a weakness last year, a major issue, especially given sort of Jordan Travis, what he did best. Not having that speed wide receiver limited that offense. They went out and they signed Malik Benson and Jaylen Brown. That's former 10 400 meters, former 10 600 meters. Those guys can fly. So problem solved. Tight end, I think you're pretty much similar with that group. Less explosiveness than you expected last year with Jaheim Bell, but then Bell got banged up. And I think this year there's maybe a little more blocking upside. You lose Bell, you add West and Courtney in that respect. You lose Biscuit. I think tight end is basically a wash. So, not really improved there. Safety depth. You lose Dent and you move Knowles back to nickel. And then you add Devontae Brown. Hussey is a year older and ready to play. And then you add Amarian Cooper back and you get Kirkland a year older. Safety depth is much less of a concern this year than it was last year. Fourth linebacker. So last year, they had Omar Graham. This year, you've got Lundy as your alpha backer. And then you have Riley and Nicholson at, as your kind of 2 and 3, and Graham and Cryer as your 3 and 4. Or your 4 and 5, really. You feel actually, I think, better about Cryer this year as your fifth backer in terms of where he's situated on the depth chart than you did about your fourth backer last year. So significant improvement there. So in terms of last year's weaknesses, I think you feel better about interior offensive line, better about offensive tackle depth, better about edge depth, better about speed at wide receiver, better at safety depth, better at your linebacker depth. I think you've improved most of those things. I think of those things, tight end being, not something that you've necessarily improved much. We'll see. And then, quarterback as a limited downfield thrower, that's really the strength of the guy you brought in. So we'll see what happens there. So then the next category, the next thing we're looking at is improved strengths. How much has this team, what were strengths last year that this team might be stronger at? And last year, there were several things that I named compared to the prior season. This season, to be honest, there's really not much room for that in most spots. Last year's season and last year's team didn't have, their strengths were strengths. And there's not a whole lot to improve on in terms of strengths that is really plausible or realistic. This season to me is not about improving the strengths that you already had, but much more about raising the team's floor by reducing the weaknesses that you had to kind of work around last year. And there were weaknesses that team did have to work around a good bit last year. As good as that team was. In this year's team, I think there's just a lot fewer weaknesses. There's a lot less to pick on that this team is going to have to scheme around than last year's team had. And that's, just comparing how I felt about last year's team going in and this year's team, I think that's the big difference. Last year's team, I think, had a little bit more superstar kind of upside with Verse and Fisk and some of those guys. This year's team, maybe a little bit less of that, but fewer weaknesses. One place where I think there might be an improved strength, I thought Keon Coleman was good at punt return last year, but he was not super, super dynamic. He had obviously the one against Miami. He had a couple that were big plays, but I think you might be better at punt return with Jalen Lucas back there or Malik Benson. I'd rather it be Lucas because of Benson's important as your number one receiver. Now, the difference there, Keon, to my recollection, didn't drop a punt. So, if you drop one punt this year, then that, makes that worse. But as long as everybody catches those punts, you might be better at punt return. And you might be better overall on special teams in terms of coverage units as well, because you're a deeper football team. So that's where you're at there. So then the next question is, okay, where are you worse than last year? So you've improved a lot of the weaknesses. Where have you taken a step back compared to last year? The 2024 season, the 2024 team, I think really has 4 spots that I could look at and go, yeah, they're probably not going to be as good at this spot as they were last year. Number 1 is wide receiver. Look, Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson were freaks. It's going to be hard to match what they brought to the table. That said, David Hale made a good point that after week 10, those guys really didn't do a whole lot last year. And really, after midseason, those guys were so hurt and so banged up. I mean, Keon Coleman was barely practicing at one point. Johnny was in concussion protocol more than once. And he got banged up, got a shoulder banged up, had other stuff. Those guys were not in week 8, in week 7, week 10, week 12. Those guys were not in those weeks what they were in weeks 1, 2, and 3. And, there's more depth at wide receiver, I think, in terms of, at least decent bodies than I think overall you had last year. So on the one hand, you look at that and you go, you don't have the freaks that you had last year that scare everybody. But on the other hand, if you stay healthier at that position, it's possible that you could end up with comparable or even better production from that position. So I'm just going to go on, looking at it before the season. You got to say this group is not going to be as good as last year's group, especially since they're not as consistent catching the football, all of that. So wide receiver is a decline from last year. Obviously, your edge peak, going from Jared Verse to just about anybody, is, you're not going to be better there. Jones, Lolahea are going to be huge additions. I think as a group on the edge, they're going to be comparable or better overall. But in terms of, what you can get for a drive or two when the chips are down, you ain't get what you got out of the peak guys from last year because of how dominant Verse could be. I think the defensive tackle pass rush is not quite as good this year as last year, most likely. With Fisk, especially late in the year, that you're not going to match that. Fourth, and finally, I think the nickel cornerback last year, I thought Jarrian Jones was the best nickel corner in the country last year. And you move to Earl Little and Kevin Knowles this year. As good as those guys might be, I don't think it's likely that they're going to be quite as good as Jarrian Jones was last year. But I don't think this is a steep decline, but I think it is a decline. And I think, those are the spots where you're maybe worse than last year, likely worse than last year. Now, next, I think special teams likely builds on what they were last year. Like I said before, you've got more depth, which means more quality on special teams. When you've got the depth at linebacker and especially defensive back that you've got on this team, you're going to have very fast, very good special teams coverage units in particular. That's how that works. So now let's go ahead and move to the next sort of stage of our analysis here, and let's look at what you can kind of expect on this team. First of all, on the offensive side, I think this is very much an on-schedule type offense. They're essentially presenting defenses with a pick-your-poison situation. Stack the box to take away the consistent running game. This is going to be a running game where they're going to bank on being high efficiency, high success rate, going to be able to block you, going to be able to bring a lot of diversity at you, and you're going to be tough to stop down to down, and they're going to stay ahead of the chains a bunch with the running game. And then they're going to play action and RPO and screen you to death on the outside if you try to stack that box. There's your pick your poison. So teams are going to stack the box and then try to take away the verticals and just force Florida State to execute in the passing game underneath. That's what you're going to do. Now, you got a very high quality running back room. You've got big play, but inconsistent wide receivers. You've got some guys at wide receiver and running back who are major weapons in the screen game. And then you've got a quarterback who's a battering ram on short yardage. That's this football team on the offensive side. maybe not as scary in certain respects, especially in terms of big game potential compared to last year's team. Last year's team was built to be big game tough in terms of what the kind of matchup problems that they would present the best defenses that maybe can stop you in the running game. This year's team sort of baked in to be more dominant against lesser teams, but maybe not having as many natural mismatches or, matchup nightmares against the best teams as last year. So there's, kind of your difference. Now, I think the improvement on the offensive line, especially on the interior, is going to mean more consistency against lesser teams. Now, I want to take you through 3 years of the offensive line backups. So 2022, your backups on the offensive line going into 2022 were Jazz Turnitine, Darius Washington, Bryson Estes, you had Schrader, and then Julian Armella. Those were your 5 backups on the offensive line. Last year, you had Bless Harris or Robert Scott slated as your back. One of them would be your backup if the other one was starting. Then Darius Washington, Keandre Jones, Julian Armella, and Jalen Early. There's your backups, your 5 backups. This year, your backups are Robert Scott, Bryson Estes, Jacob Rizzi, and Otto, sort of as an or there as a backup at center, Ferguson, Simmons, and Early. Now, yeah, I named more names because there are 12 offensive linemen listed on the depth chart. And by the way, that's a way for the coaching staff to signal these are the guys that we have confidence putting on the field. And I would venture to say that they essentially fully trust 10 of those guys. Most years, I mean, you go back to 2022, I think I remember saying they trusted 7 offensive linemen on that team. And it was really like 6.5. Last year, they went into the season trusting 8. This year, I think they trust 10 or 11. It's a big, big difference. What that means is you expect less variance in most games. Against teams that you should beat, you're going to get less variance because you're going to be able to crockpot teams. You're going to be able to basically wear teams down with just winning up front, running the football, staying ahead of the chains, and just being frustrating. And, it looks like it's competitive in the first quarter because it's 7-0. Then, it's 14-3 at the half. Then you look up and at the end of the third quarter, it's 31-3. And you get into the fourth quarter, mid fourth quarter, it's 38-3, and now you got your backups all out there mid fourth quarter, and you go, well, what happened? And they just got crockpotted. That's the kind of football team this is going to be offensively. And I think there's also enough speed and weapons on this team to think that Mike Norvell is going to be able to scheme up some big plays each week. So, you have that sort of consistency down to down, and then he's going to find a way to scheme up, 2-3 big plays that may score in any given week using his toys, the high speed weapons. So that's a winning formula. And it gives you 30 plus per game, most likely. Each week you're going to score more than 30, against all but maybe 2 or 3 of your opponents. You're pretty well guaranteed that. And then on the other side of the ball, I think this is going to be a top 3 to 5 defense in the country. Yeah, I think it's going to be that good. I think Florida State's defense this year is a top 3 to 5 opponent adjusted defense in the country. So when you look at SP plus, FEI, those sorts of metrics at the end of the season, I think this Florida State defense very well may be a top 3 to 5 defense in the country. I think they're going to be suffocating on the back end. That's going to be one of the 3 or 4 best secondaries in the country. And I think with the bodies that you have on the defensive line, I think they're going to be able to go light box against almost anybody and basically let that secondary tee off. last year, when they were able to do that, that led to them being the best team in the country stopping the pass. They were the best pass defense in the country last year. And I see no reason to think that can't be similar this year. And you look at what they're going to be able to do in terms of bodies. You put Darrell Jackson and Joshua Farmer out there at both defensive tackles, it's going to be tough to run between the tackles against those two guys. And then you get Lundy behind them at backer, and he's a very good run-stopping backer. And then you've got Lolohea, Peyton, Marvin Jones as your top three, along with Byron Turner, a year older. You got some guys that it's going to be tough to run on that box. And then you add a Cam Riley at 235 pounds there as well, 6'5". You're going to be able to go light box on a lot of teams and just let your secondary attack. So you combine that sort of on-schedule offense with that top 3 to 5 defense, and if you just don't screw around with a bunch of turnovers and all that, you're able to basically hold serve against the teams that you should beat. And on top of that, and this is something to think about, and I was texting with Steve Pointer about this, so credit to him on looking up these numbers. But this is also a team of absolute grown men. This is something that very few people, at least that I've seen, have talked about with respect to this Florida State team, is the experience and the old bodies that this team is throwing out there. 22 out of the 33 guys listed on the offensive depth chart, which, first of all, 33 guys listed on the offensive depth chart means you feel really good about your depth. But 22 of those guys are fourth year and older. 14 of your 29 on the defensive depth chart are fourth year or older. 7 of your defensive line are fourth year and older. These are grown blank men, y'all. This team has 192 starts on its offensive line. 96 starts in your defensive line. 99 starts represented in your defensive backfield. 69 starts in your offensive backfield. This is a very, very experienced football team of grown men. This is the kind of team, experience-wise, that you used to see from like those Wake Forest teams that would punch so far above their weight in terms of recruiting. And one of the reasons that they would do that is that those guys were 22, 23, 24 years old. And at 23-year-old or 22-year-old against a 19-year-old is a difference at this level. And this Florida State team has a bunch of grown men, guys who are above the drinking age. All right, that actually should be a number. How many guys in your 2 or 3 deep are above the drinking age? Almost all of them are for Florida State. This is an old football team. And that might be the best reason to take the over in terms of the season total. This is a very experienced team. Now, in terms of reasons that you might take the under in terms of the season total, so under you expect 9-3 or 8-4 of this team. The reasons to take the under, there aren't a bunch of them. The number one is passing game inconsistency. DJ Uiagalelei is not going to be confused with, Peyton Manning when it comes to, overall accuracy in the short passing game and basically the ability to be a top-notch sort of short to intermediate thrower in an air raid type thing. This is not an offense that's built to play from behind a bunch. You get down 14 points with this offense, and they have to go into 2-minute and win by spreading the field and chucking the ball all over. That's not ideal for this offense. This is an offense that's going to play much better from, even or ahead. So that's one thing you look at and you go, okay, well, you've got a lower floor in terms of your passing game this year than you had last year. I think your ceiling might actually be, comparably high, but not the floor, because you just had some freaks out there. Second thing is I think your defensive tackle backups are less dynamic overall this year than last year. So last year, I mean, you look at who the backups were. You had Fabian Lovett, who was not fully healthy last year. Just so you think about that. Fabian Lovett was your number 3, a little bit more dynamic there as a backup defensive tackle, I think, than what you're bringing out last year. But that's debatable enough. So, I mean, those are your reasons. Now, getting to breaking down the games and looking at the schedule itself. A few years ago, I started doing it this way. You basically look at the number of games that Florida State has a significant advantage in. So those should be, pencil in a win. Then you got the should win games where, the team is favored. You should win the football game, but that other team has enough that they could beat you realistically. So you're looking at, win probabilities, for example, significant advantages, 80% or more. You're going to win that game 85% or more. Then you got your should win games. So, 60 to 75% type area, or 60 to, under 80%, where, you're going to win more than you lose in those games, but those are still dangerous teams. Then you got coin flip games where, look, you're just looking at all things being equal. Those rosters are pretty even, looking at where it is in the schedule. Think about that as close to 50-50, somewhere under 60-40 either way. Then you got your should lose games. Those are games where the other team is advantaged, but you've got a good puncher's chance. And then you've got your overmatched games. Those are games where, good luck. You probably can't block them, and, they can block you. So going back a few years, this is how I broke things down the last few years. 2021, I had 3 games in the significant advantage category: Jacksonville State, UMass, and Syracuse. Florida State lost one of those games to Jacksonville State. Yikes. Should win, I had 2 games in that category: Louisville and NC State. They lost both of those games. 2021, I had 2 games as coin flip games, and they split those 1-1, Wake Forest and Boston College. I had 3 games in the should lose category: Notre Dame, UNC, and Miami, and they won 2 of those 3. And then I had 2 in the overmatched category, and they lost both of those, Clemson and Florida. So overall, kind of not quite to chalk, lost a couple games they should have won that year, and lost one where they had a significant advantage. And then they won 2 games that they were in the should lose category. So there you go. 2022, I had 4 games instead of 3 in the significant edge category: Duquesne, Georgia Tech, at Syracuse, and Louisiana. 3 in the should win, and they went 4-0 there. 3 in the should win category. They went 2-1 there with Louisville, BC, and Wake. Lost to Wake. I had 4 in the coin flip category: Florida, LSU, Miami, and NC State. And they went 3-1 in those, losing only to NC State. 0 in the should lose, and they didn't lose any of those, obviously. And then 1 in the overmatched. That was Clemson. So that was 2022. And you can see the difference. They're getting better roster-wise. They had fewer games in the overmatched and should lose. They only had 1 there. They had 5 there in 2021. Last year, I had 7 games in the significant edge category. So that was Southern Miss, at BC, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Duke, Wake, and North Alabama. Obviously, they won all of those. I had 3 in the should win category: at Pitt, who I overranked going into last season, as most people did, Miami, and at Florida. And they won all 3 of those, obviously. I had 2 in the coin flip category: LSU and Clemson. LSU, they dominated that game, though there were a few plays that LSU missed that could have gotten that closer to parity. And then, obviously, Clemson went into overtime, so that was a coin flip game. And then I had none in the should lose or overmatch category last year. That, again, shows you how much the program has progressed. This year, just like last year, I have 7 games in the significant edge category. That's Charleston Southern, Cal, Memphis, Duke, Georgia Tech, Boston College, and UNC. Those are games where if Florida State plays anything like they're supposed to, they take care of business and they win by double digits. I've got 2 games then in the should win category this year. And that is Florida and at SMU. Those 2 games I put in the should win category. And again, that is a category where, look, if you take care of business, if you just play like you're supposed to, you should be able to take care of business and win this game. You're the better football team, but you're going to actually have to take care of business, because if you don't, that team has enough talent, enough other things, potentially in play that they could bite you. So you have to, you actually have to play well enough to beat them. You're not going to get that team with your C game. You're going to have to play your B game or better to beat that team. And to me, there's 2 of those on the schedule this year. That's Florida and at SMU. So I think there's 9 wins right there where if you just hold serve and you win the games that you should win, you got 9 wins right there. And this, by the way, is what we've talked about. The reason I started doing it this way is to talk about what Florida State needed to do to get back to where they were in contention year in, year out. And what I kept saying is, look, the teams that get to the playoff, the teams that win conferences, the teams that are consistently good year in and year out are so good and so much better than the other teams on their schedule that year in, year out, they're really only playing 3 or 4 games that are, potential losses. And it wasn't until last year that in the preseason, I felt Florida State was getting to that point where, they just didn't have a whole lot of games on the schedule that you looked at and you go, those are teams that can beat them. I mean, last year they had 2 coin flip games and 3 should win games. I mean, those are 5 games where you feel like they had a shot, where the team that was playing against them had a realistic shot of beating them. And, that was where they were. That's why they went undefeated. They took care of business in those games. This year, I think, again, you have 5 of those. Instead of 3 should wins and 2 coin flips, this year I think you got 2 should wins and 3 coin flips. You might argue for UNC in the should win category instead of the significant edge, but for several reasons, mostly on the line of scrimmage, I think that actually is where I would put them. But honestly, I think that's where things stand. So this is a team where it makes sense that 9 wins is kind of your floor in a lot of ways, because if you just take care of business, that's 9 wins. If you win 2 of the 3 coin flips and you take care of business in all the others, you got 11 wins. If you split your should wins and you go 1-1 there, you win 7 games with the significant edge, you split your should wins and you go 1-1. Now you're 8-1 there. And then let's say you lose 2 of your 3 coin flips, you're still 9-4. Or you're still 9-3. Math. I do math really, really well. I do the maths. But yeah, you're still 9-3. So that makes sense on why I think with this team, this is a 9-win floor. Now, last year, when I looked at the schedule, what I said was the following. Both the floor and the ceiling have been raised over 2022. And there's a real chance that this team could go undefeated. There are really 5 games that they shouldn't have a sizable advantage. That held up, and they did go undefeated. This year, here's what I have to say. The floor has been further raised even over 2023. I think the ceiling is actually about the same. This is a team that can go undefeated. Now, you could argue that the ceiling is lower due to the lack of the freaks, Keon, Johnny, and Jaheim on offense, and Jared Verse in particular on defense. And maybe you add Fisk in there as well. You could argue that the ceiling is lower due to the lack of the top-end freaks there. But Keon, Johnny, and Jaheim were all hurt in the first month of the season and were not quite themselves most of that year. So comparing, preseason to preseason, you can maybe make that case, but that team didn't actually hit their ceiling, even though they did go undefeated. And I think you could argue that the ceiling of this year's team could actually wind up higher due to the speed on offense across the board and a quarterback who I think has more capacity as a downfield thrower. Certain areas, I think Jordan Travis is irreplaceable and, deserves his respect and his laurels for being one of the best quarterbacks in Florida State history. But I also am aware of what some of his limitations were in the passing game. And I think in certain things, DJ Uiagalelei can do more. Overall, though, my take is this team has a lower floor in the passing game and kind of a comparable ceiling in the passing game because of the speed. But I think it has a higher floor in the running game and a comparable ceiling in the running game. So that's where we are. Now, if we're looking at my actual win totals here based on, percentages and win shares, I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. So first game, Georgia Tech in Ireland. I'll do a fuller preview of that in a couple days. But I've got that as 0.85, so 85% chance of a Florida State win, right around a 21 to 24 point win. I haven't totally settled on it. I'm going to look at a few more things there. I always do a little bit more homework for the actual in-season previews. But 0.85 there. Boston College on the Monday night then, on Labor Day, I've got as a 0.9. I would have that higher, but Castellanos is dangerous, and you could have a quarterback get hot, and any team that has a quarterback that's capable of just going in fuego in one way or another, I bumped the percentage down just a little bit. Memphis, I think that's a 0.9 game, so 90% chance there. That's a good Memphis team, but I think they're going to have the basic problem that they've got is can they block them? And if I'm looking at the significant edge category, the 7 teams that I put in the significant edge category, with maybe the exception of Boston College, the reason they're in that significant edge category is I don't think those teams can block Florida State. I think that's what it boils down to. Charleston Southern, Cal, Memphis, Duke, Georgia Tech, Boston College, and UNC. I think of those teams, Georgia Tech and Boston College are probably the 2 best offensive lines of those teams. UNC's got some guys in the running game, I think, that are going to be a handful, but may have a little more trouble pass blocking this year. But I think those 7 teams have trouble blocking you. And that's why I've got those teams less likely to win. And I think that's the problem for Memphis. So 0.9. Then Cal, I've got that as 0.95. Cal's better than a lot of people think, but again, I don't think they can block you. At SMU, this is a game where, FPI and some others have, this below 60%. It's 58%. I've got this at 75%. I think, again, the issue here is, can SMU block Florida State for 4 quarters? And I'm skeptical about that, but I do give them the benefit of the doubt because they've got a quality quarterback and they got players on the outside. That's a very good wide receiver room. They've got a quarterback who can get hot. So, if there's a team in that group that, you kind of look at and you go, could give you some trouble, SMU on the road for a game that's going to be super rowdy. That's going to be the biggest game in program history there in recent program history for, probably 25 years, probably the biggest game there. It's going to be a tough atmosphere. A lot of reasons there to think that will be a tougher game than a lot of people think. And then you follow that up with Clemson at home. And this is one of those games where, I've got it marked as basically a coin flip. But I still favor Florida State about 0.65 in this game. So that's on the margins of a coin flip game. The reason I have this at 0.65 is I still don't believe in Clemson's wide receivers and quarterback group in terms of really being able to cause a lot of problems for a Florida State level secondary. And I think Clemson is actually going to have some trouble blocking Florida State. So this is going to be one of those low-scoring games because Clemson's defense is what gives them the chance to beat Florida State. But I think between the two teams, FSU has a little bit more balance offensively and more playmakers, more big play type guys. I think you end up with a couple big plays in that game where FSU has some speed guys that will be able to run away and make the, one or two plays that change that game. And that's the difference there. So I got 0.65 there. Some people are going to have that a little lower, but I think that's about right. Duke on a Friday night after a bye there. I've got that as 0.9. I think Duke is going to be better than a lot of people think, but again, I'm not sure they can block you. Then you get to one of the other coin flip games that I've got designated, and that's at Miami. And I think of ACC conference games, can make a case for Clemson because I think Clemson's got the best defense that you're going to face. But I think overall, the toughest game on this schedule is probably Miami because of the combination of quarterback, quality offensive line. You've got some real potential on that defensive line and some depth there. I think Miami probably can match up with you on the line of scrimmage better than anybody else on your schedule. And that includes Notre Dame, now that Notre Dame's lost their stud left tackle. I think Miami's likely to have the best line of scrimmage combination that you're going to face. And then they got Cam Ward, who can cause you problems. That's going to be a war. That's going to be a really tough game. I've got Florida State favored 0.6 in that game. So barely, that's a, one score type win on the road. And again, the reason that I favor FSU there is I have some real doubts about Miami's back seven. Now, the thing is, Miami's weakness on defense lines up with Florida State's least consistent group on offense. But again, I figure Norvell's going to be able to scheme, a Jaylen Brown or a Malik Benson, somebody like that, open a couple times deep in that one. You get a couple breakaways there, and that changes that game. And I don't think Miami has a whole lot of difference makers. I mean, they're going to depend on Restrepo, and I think Florida State's got the players to cover him. I don't think they have a bunch of difference makers to catch the football for Ward. So I'm going to go with 0.6, but that's of all the games on this schedule, that's the game in the ACC that I think is the toughest. Then UNC at home after that. This is the sandwich spot. This is, if you were going to look at the schedule and you wanted to be a team to play Florida State, this is the spot you'd want to play them. After and at Miami, you get back late from Miami, either high from a win or low from your loss in a rivalry game, and then you got to turn around and play a pretty good UNC team. I think this is probably an 8-win UNC team. And I think they're going to be pretty good on the defensive. They've got some pass rushers on the defensive line. They could end up being okay at defensive tackle. I've got some questions there. And they're going to have one of the better secondaries in the conference. And they'll be able to run the football. The real question for them is going to be pass blocking more than anything else. And, quarterback replacing Drake May is an issue. Max Johnson is a good player, but he's not Drake May. But this is the spot. This is the trap game spot after Miami and before road trip to Notre Dame. That said, I think ultimately, again, the problem is UNC probably can't pass protect against FSU, and they're going to depend on running the football and being physical all year. And I think that's going to be an uphill battle against this defense. So 0.85 in this game against UNC. Now I got the road trip to Notre Dame. It's the one game on the schedule where I have Florida State as an underdog. I think that Notre Dame team with Riley Leonard and some of the other pieces that they've got, it's going to be a really good football team. And this being on the road at the end of a month that is Duke at Miami, UNC, and then finally that road trip to Notre Dame, I think this is the game where you're most likely to trip up on this schedule. Might be your second loss, could be your third loss, but this is, I think, the most likely loss on this schedule. I think it's a less likely loss than it was 3 weeks ago because of, again, Notre Dame was going to be the team I thought was going to have the best shot at being able to block you up front. They lost for the season their stud left tackle, and now they're thin at left tackle or at the tackle spot overall. They had to move their right guy to the left, from what I understand. They got some questions about what they're going to do on the right. But, I think Riley Leonard's really good. I think they've got some players that can cause you problems. And, that's a team that they're probably going to be stout enough on the defensive front where you're not going to be able to just pound them and win that football game. But maybe I'm wrong. But I think this one's close. Got this one favored. Notre Dame, Florida State, like 0.45 chance of winning that. Charleston Southern's a 1.0. And then Florida in the home finale there at 0.75. Again, a rivalry game. I think that Florida team has been really banged up by that point in the year. It's going to be interesting to see if Napier is still coaching them, but we'll see where that Florida team is. But again, I put that as a sort of should win game rather than a significant edge game because Florida is enormous on both lines. One thing you've got to give a lot of credit to Napier and that whole Florida staff is that they have put their pieces together. And I was talking to Steve Pointer about this not long ago. They put that team together with a clear vision. They want to be really big and tough to move on both lines. They want to pound the football. They want to play bully ball on the offensive and defensive lines and force you to beat them in the secondary with Florida talent in the secondary, and then be able to run, have a hard time stopping their size and being able to run the football and play action you on the offensive side. Well, Florida State's going to try to do that to teams too this year. I think FSU's overall better, but all things told, that's not a guaranteed win against Florida this year because, again, they are really big. They're going to be, better equipped to stop the run with their size on the interior than just about anybody you play, maybe anybody you play. Aside from basically the four defenses that might have the players to really stop you in the running game or to limit your running game. You play only four defenses this season, I think, that have that. And that's Clemson, Miami, Notre Dame, and Florida. North Carolina has some pieces that might make it difficult as well. Maybe kind of an outside fifth. But at most, I think you're playing five defenses that really have the dudes to cause you a lot of problems in the running game. Florida's one of those. So that's another game you have to, chalk in as a potential loss, but not one that I have lower than 0.75. I still think you win 3 out of 4 of those if you line up and play them 4 times. So that leaves me with a win total of 9.55 on the year. So I've got the over there, the over 9.5 by 500ths. So if I'm just betting that basic, I'm not betting that, right? That's push. And at the same point, if you're looking at more likely to wind up at 9 wins or 10 wins, 9.55 tells you just a slight tilt towards 10 wins. Slight tilt. Now, a couple things to note here. In terms of how win totals work and these percentages and additive percentages and all of that, I think this is the best way to predict seasons. I've said this for 15 years that I've been doing this. That said, I do think teams with quality quarterback play and outstanding line of scrimmage play, and then veterans across the board. So veteran teams with quality quarterback play and strong line of scrimmage punch above their weight relative to formulaic expectations. I said this last year as well. So veteran teams that are good on both lines of scrimmage and have good quarterback play punch above the percentages. So what I said last year was the following. My numbers say 10-2 is the most likely record. I think my win shares came out to 10.18 last year, 9.55 this year. So last year I said, my numbers say 10-2 is the most likely record, but I think this is a team with great culture and leadership and studs in the right spot. So I think they're more likely to end up bettering that. If this team starts 4-0, I think they run the table. Either way, I think this team should be the favorite to win the ACC. So that's what I said last year. This year, here's what I've got to say. My numbers say either 9 or 10, 9-3 or 10-2 are the most likely records. But I think this is a team with great culture and leadership and with a bunch of grown men on the line of scrimmage and elsewhere. So I think they're likely to wind up bettering that number. So if you're looking at, choosing between 9 and 10, I think this is a 10-win team. And actually, I think they run the table on the games that they're supposed to win. And so that leaves the season down to 3 key games: Clemson, Miami, and Notre Dame. You win 2 of the 3 of those, and I think this is an 11-win team. You go 11-1 in the regular season. You earn the ACC title berth, and I think they'll win the ACC. I think this is your best team in the ACC. And I think they're likely to win either 10 or 11 games in the regular season and then wind up in the ACC title game and then win the ACC. And wind up with a top 4 seed, most likely. So that's my expectation. I think this is a team that will be a little better than a lot of the folks around the program, covering it, think. Partly because of that grown man factor. And partly because at a certain point, you got to trust Mike Norvell. The guy's earned it. His teams continually punch above their weight and in those games that are coin flip games. Early on, they lost some games they shouldn't lose. Then they stopped doing that because they started raising the talent floor. But he's always going to have teams that punch above their weight in the games that are, 50-50 or worse. And so I think this team, if I'm going to pick a most likely record, I think, the numbers say, maybe 10-2. I think this is an 11-1 team. And again, don't be shocked if this team manages to win out, because I think the floor is really high. But I do think they have enough spots, the questions in the passing game are just enough to think, they've got some vulnerability for a team that gets hot the right way. But I think it's going to be really hard for teams to move the football in this defense and to score enough points to beat this team. Okay, so now turning the preview to some national stuff, kind of like I did last year. Looking at the Heisman race, I think this is a pretty open Heisman race, but if I had to pick a front runner, it's Carson Beck because of how good Georgia's likely to be, and I think he's a quarterback who's going to look really good in what they do. Quinn Ewers is going to be a guy that's probably going to get a lot of buzz there, though I think he's very overrated. I think he's not nearly the pro prospect a lot of people think he is. His warts showed in some big games last year. Will Howard is going to have a chance to be in New York as well because he's got the keys to a Ferrari up there. And we'll see how good that Ohio State team is. But any quarterback who's quarterbacking an Ohio State team well into the hunt, into the national title hunt, is going to have a chance. Nico Iamaleava is going to be a guy that I think has some buzz out of Tennessee, and a sort of a dark horse for me is Connor Wegman from Texas A&M. And I think A&M is going to be a tougher out this year than a lot of people think in the SEC. And Wegman, I think, is really, really good. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. As far as my conference champ, my picks in the different conferences for the SEC, I'm going with Georgia. No surprise there. Big 10, Ohio State. Big 12, Utah. Obviously in the ACC, I've already said I'm picking Florida State to win that conference. For my playoff picks, this is just the Final Four because that's the only playoff that matters. The 12 team is basically just window dressing to get to the 4 teams that can actually win. And I think the last 4 teams still playing are probably, if I had to guess right now, it's going to be based on how these things get set up and, bracketing and all of that. I'm going to go with Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Florida State. I think Florida State winds up in that Final Four. I don't think they're likely to, advance beyond that necessarily, because I think the other 3 there all have some advantages roster wise over what you got. But again, don't bet against Mike Norvell in those kind of games. But as of right now, I'll go with Ohio State as the likely national champ because they are the most talented team, and I think they've got the best schedule for it. They've loaded up that roster. They do have some question marks on the line of scrimmage, which does make things interesting. So, I think this is a year where the door is open for somebody that's not in, say, the top 3 or 4. I think nobody is quite flawless enough this year to be a true odds-on favorite. I mean, you could argue for Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Bama, Michigan, LSU, even Florida State. You could make arguments for any of those teams and I could potentially buy it. As you get down past Texas, to Bama, Michigan, LSU, and Florida State, that argument gets tougher to make. I mean, Bama is starting a running back at quarterback. Michigan has questions at quarterback and on offense and general passing game. LSU has a number of questions there, but they're going to be really strong on the line of scrimmage, particularly on the offensive side. I think that's a very dangerous LSU team. And then I think this Florida State team has a shot. Certain things would have to fall right, and they'd have to really get things to work in the passing game beyond what I think is most likely. They got enough on the line of scrimmage, and you got a very seasoned, big time arm quarterback who could all of a sudden light the world on fire with the right stuff. Get himself in rhythm and all of those things with the running game support. You just never know, because again, when you're really good on the line of scrimmage, you put yourself in a lot of football games. So we'll see. But all in all, I think this is going to be a really fun, really interesting year for Florida State. It's too bad that they've made that some of the other changes in college football have been made, and overall, I think the sport has gotten less interesting because of the 12 team playoff in so many respects. But maybe I wind up in the minority there. But we will see. In any case, we've gone over an hour. I think this preseason has been worthy of that length of a preview. I'm going to go ahead and leave off here. Thanks to everybody who's been going through this with me and listening, continuing to listen. Numbers are a little bit down here early in the season in terms of listenership. Haven't fully gotten everybody back from when I took the leave of absence over the summer. So feel free to share this. Rate it on your podcast manager of choice, Apple Music, whatever else, or Apple Podcasts. Really appreciate those of you who've stuck with me over the years. It's good to be back for another year. It's going to be really interesting. Be back soon with the Georgia Tech preview. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.